My name is Arthur Mendez, and I am 74 years old. I live alone in an old wooden house that sits on the hillside above São Roque do Val, a place where the world seems to forget itself. It has been more than a decade since Clara died, more than a decade since my children packed their lives into boxes and drove away toward cities whose names I can barely remember now. They call sometimes on Sundays, and their voices sound like echoes from another lifetime. I tell them I am fine. I tell them the house is holding up. I tell them I have everything I need. And when I hang up the phone, the silence returns like water filling a well. The house is surrounded by fog. It rises from the river in the early mornings and again in the evenings, a thick white curtain that makes the world small. Some days I wake and cannot see past the porch. The trees disappear. The road disappears. Even the sky becomes nothing more than a gray memory hovering somewhere above. I've come to understand that fog is not just moisture and cold air meeting in the valley. It is a kind of erasure. It takes away distance, takes away color, takes away the certainty that anything exists beyond what you can touch with your own hands. I wake early, always before dawn. My body has kept this rhythm for so long that I no longer need an alarm. The bed creaks when I rise, the same creak it has made for 30 years. I put on my wool sweater, the one Clara knitted the winter before she got sick, and I walk barefoot across the cold wooden floor to the kitchen. The stove is old, cast iron, heavy as gilt. I light it with kindling and yesterday's newspaper, and I wait for the fire to catch. There's something meditative in this waiting, something that steadies the day before it begins. The flame grows, the metal ticks as it heats, and the room slowly fills with warmth. I make coffee in the same tin pot I have used since the children were young. The smell of it is one of the few things that still feels familiar, still feels like proof that I am the same man I was 40 years ago. I sit at the table and drink it black, looking out through the window at the orchard. The apple trees are gnarled and old, older than my marriage, older than this grief. They still produce fruit, though not much. I tend to them because Clara loved them. I prune them in winter, collect the apples in autumn, and watch them stand bare and patient through the months between. Most of my days are like this, simple, repetitive. I read the same books Clara used to read, novels with broken spines and pages soft as cloth. I listen to the radio, not because I care about the news or the agricultural reports, but because I need to hear human voices. Without them, I think I might forget what conversation sounds like. I might forget that the world is still turning somewhere beyond this valley, beyond this fog. I was an engineer for 40 years. I worked with numbers, with materials, with things that could be measured and tested and proven. I built bridges, I built roads. I believed in the tangible, in what could be held and examined under light. I never had patience for ghost stories or superstitions. I never believed in things that could not be explained. And perhaps that is why what I'm about to tell you disturbs me so deeply. Because everything I have seen, everything I have lived through in these past months has been real. And I have proof. But proof means nothing when no one believes you. I have learned that the hard way. I have learned that the world prefers its mysteries to remain mysteries, its shadows to remain shadows. To pull something into the light, to name it, to show it to others, is to become an outsider. It is to step into a loneliness that is sharper and colder than any I have known before. Time moves strangely here. There are days when I feel as though I am living inside a photograph, trapped in a single frozen moment that will not release me. The fog, the trees, the sound of the wind through the porch boards, they all repeat endlessly, like a song played on a broken record. I've tried to leave. I've thought about selling the house, moving closer to one of my children, starting again somewhere with clean air and neighbors who wave good morning. But I cannot. Something holds me here. Maybe it is Clara. Maybe it is the weight of all these years, or maybe it is something else, something I have not yet found the words to name. At night, I sit in the chair by the window and watch the darkness settle over the valley. The fog thickens, the stars disappear. The world contracts until it is only this room, this chair, this breath. And I wait. I do not know what I am waiting for. I only know that waiting has become my entire life. I am not a man who believes in omens. I do not read meaning into the flight of birds or the shape of clouds. But there are nights when I feel something watching me from beyond the tree line, something patient and vast and indifferent. I tell myself it is only the isolation, the way a mind begins to invent companions when it is left too long alone. But deep down, beneath the rational explanations, I know better. I know that something has changed. The air feels heavier now. The silence feels less like absence and more like presence. And the fog, when it rises, carries with it a smell I cannot place, something damp and metallic, something that does not belong to this valley. I do not sleep well anymore. I lie awake and listen to the house settling, the wind scraping branches against the roof, the distant sound of the river moving through the dark. And sometimes, just before dawn, I hear something else, a sound like weight being dragged across the earth, slow, deliberate, close. I tell myself it is nothing. I tell myself I am old and tired and that the mind plays tricks when the body grows weak. But in the morning, when I step outside and see the marks in the mud, I know that I am not imagining it. I know that something is out there, beyond the fog, beyond the trees, waiting in the space between what I can see and what I cannot. This is where the story begins. Not with answers, but with questions. Not with certainty, but with doubt. And as I sit here now writing these words in the dim light of a fading afternoon, I wonder if I will ever find the courage to face what I already know is true. That loneliness is not the worst thing that can happen to a man. The worst thing is realizing that you are not alone after all. It was a May morning when it began, though I did not recognize it as a beginning then. I woke in the dark, the kind of dark that exists only in the hours before dawn, when even the fog seems to hold its breath. There was a sound outside. I remember lying perfectly still, listening, trying to place it. It was not the wind. It was not an animal. It was something heavy being dragged across wet ground, a scraping that seemed to come from near the shed, maybe closer. My heart was already beating faster, but I told myself it was nothing, just a branch fallen in the night, just the old wood of the property settling into the earth. I got out of bed and went to the window. The fog was thicker than I had ever seen it, a white wall pressed against the glass. I opened the window slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and leaned out into the cold. The air smelled of damp soil and something else, something I could not name. I called out, my voice sounding small and foolish in the emptiness. No one answered, and then I realized that there was no sound at all. No crickets, no birds stirring in the pre-dawn, no distant hum of the highway. Just silence, the kind that feels like pressure against your eardrums. I closed the window and stood there for a long time, staring into the white. Eventually, I went back to bed, but I did not sleep. I lay there and listened, and the silence remained absolute, as if the world itself had paused. When morning came, I went outside to check the property. The fog had lifted enough to see the ground, and that was when I found them. Tracks, deep impressions in the mud near the shed, leading away toward the orchard and then disappearing into the grass. They looked almost like footprints, but the shape was wrong, too large, too wide. I crouched down beside one and measured it with my hand. My palm barely covered half the width, and the stride, the distance between each print, was nearly 2 meters. No human being walks like that. No animal I know of leaves marks like that. I stood there in the damp grass, my knees aching, my breath visible in the cold air, and I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a hiker, someone lost, someone with unusually large boots. Maybe it was a prank, teenagers from the village playing games on the old man who lives alone. Maybe I had measured wrong, maybe the mud had distorted the shape. But even as I thought these things, I knew they were not true. I have been measuring and calculating for most of my life. I know what I saw, and I knew even then that something was wrong. I did not tell anyone. Who would I tell? The neighbors are far, and we do not speak often. My children would think I was losing my mind, slipping into the confusion that comes with age. And perhaps I was. Perhaps I am. But the tracks were real. I took photographs of them with my old camera, though the images came out blurry and inconclusive. By the time I developed the film, the rain had come and washed the prints away, leaving only smooth mud in my memory. That night, I left the radio on. I told myself it was for company, but really it was because I was afraid of the silence. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold in my hands, and I listened to the voices coming from the speaker, voices talking about weather patterns and crop yields and elections in distant cities. They felt impossibly far away, as if they existed in a different world entirely, a world where strange footprints did not appear in the night. And then, just after midnight, I heard it again. That same dragging sound. Slow, methodical, closer this time. I turned off the radio and sat frozen in my chair, listening. It moved around the side of the house, past the porch, toward the back where the old clothesline stands. I could hear it, the weight of it, the way the ground seemed to shift under its passage. And then it stopped. Right outside the kitchen window, I could feel it there, just beyond the glass, separated from me by nothing but a pane and a curtain. I did not move. I did not breathe. I do not know how long I sat there, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, slowly, the sound began to move away, back toward the tree line, fading into the distance until it was gone. I waited until dawn before I stood up. My legs were stiff, my back aching from sitting so long in one position. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain. The fog was there again, as always, covering everything. But I could see the grass, trampled and wet, leading away from the house. I could see where something had stood, right where I had felt it standing. That morning I walked to the neighbor's property, nearly a kilometer away through the woods. His dog, a large shepherd mix that usually barks at anything that moves, was silent when I approached. I found it lying in the dirt near the kennel, shaking. When I got close, it whimpered and crawled backward, its eyes wide and white-rimmed. I'd never seen an animal look like that before, not outside of a veterinary emergency. It looked like it had seen something that broke something inside it. I asked the neighbor if he had heard anything unusual the night before. He shrugged and said the dog had been acting strange, barking frantically around 3 a.m. and then suddenly going quiet. He thought maybe it was a fox or a wild boar. But when I looked at the dog again, I knew it was not a fox. Animals know things we do not. They can sense what we cannot see. And that dog had seen something. I walked back home slowly, my mind turning over possibilities, discarding them one by one. I am not a superstitious man. I do not believe in monsters or spirits, but I believe in evidence. I believe in what I can see and touch and measure. And the evidence was telling me that something was out there, something large and heavy and deliberate, something that moved through the fog like it belonged there, like it had always been there, waiting. That night, I set up one of the old security cameras I had installed years ago, back when Clara worried about thieves. I pointed it at the orchard, at the place where the tracks had led. I did not expect it to capture anything, but I needed to try. I needed to know that I was not imagining it, that the world had not simply tilted off its axis and left me stranded in some half-real nightmare. I went to bed that night with the camera recording, its small red light blinking in the darkness like a heartbeat, and I dreamed of fog and footsteps and the feeling of being watched by something I could not name. 3 days passed before I remembered to check the camera. I'd been avoiding it, I think. Some part of me did not want to know what it might have recorded, did not want to see proof of what I already suspected. But on a gray morning, with rain tapping against the windows and the house feeling smaller than usual, I finally disconnected the camera and brought it inside. My hands were shaking as I removed the memory card and inserted it into the old laptop my daughter had given me years ago, the one I barely knew how to use. The file took a long time to load. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the progress bar creep across the screen, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. The rain outside was steady now, a constant drumming that made the world feel enclosed, intimate. When the video finally opened, I pressed play and leaned forward, my eyes straining in the dim light of the screen. For the first hour, there was nothing. Just the orchard, the branches swaying slightly in the breeze, the fog drifting through like smoke. The timestamp in the corner showed the hours passing, 2 in the morning, then 3. I began to think that I had set the camera up for nothing, that whatever I had heard had avoided that particular angle. And then, at 4:12 in the morning, something moved. At first I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the fog and the infrared light. But as I watched, the shape became clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, moving between the trees with a slow, deliberate gait. The figure seemed to struggle with its own weight, leaning forward as if gravity pulled harder on it than on anything else. The proportions were wrong, the limbs were too long, the torso too broad. It moved like something that was not meant to walk upright, something that had learned the motion but had not perfected it. I paused the video and sat back, my heart pounding. My mouth was dry. I felt the way I had felt once as a young man when I nearly stepped off a cliff in the dark, that sudden vertigo, that understanding that the world is more dangerous than we allow ourselves to believe. I took a breath and pressed play again. The figure moved closer to the camera, and for a moment I could see more detail. It seemed to be covered in something, cloth or hair or something else, something that hung in ragged strips from its frame. And then it stopped. It stood there among the trees, perfectly still, as if it had heard something or sensed something. And slowly, with a movement that seemed almost curious, it turned its head toward the camera. I will never forget what I saw in that moment. The face, if it could be called a face, was partially obscured, hidden beneath shadow and whatever covered it. But there were eyes, 2 points of light, bright and reflective, catching the infrared glow of the camera. They did not blink. They did not move. They simply stared, directly into the lens, directly at me across time and distance. I stopped the video. My hand was trembling so badly that I nearly knocked the laptop off the table. I sat there for a long time, staring at the frozen frame, at those eyes, and I felt something inside me crack, because this was not imagination. This was not the fog playing tricks or my old mind inventing phantoms. This was real. This was recorded. This was proof. I tried to enhance the image, adjusting the brightness and contrast, zooming in on the figure. The more I manipulated it, the grainier it became, but certain details remained clear. The height, at least 8 or 9 feet, the width of the shoulders, broader than any man, the way it stood, slightly hunched, as if the world was too small for it. And those eyes, always those eyes, staring back at me with something that might have been intelligence or might have been hunger. I could not tell. I saved the file and made copies, burning it onto a disk and transferring it to a USB drive. I needed others to see it. I needed someone to confirm that I was not losing my mind, that what I had captured was real and undeniable. I thought of my old colleague, Eduardo, who had worked with me for years analyzing materials and structures. He had retired to the coast, but we still exchanged emails occasionally, brief messages about weather and health and memory. I sent him the video with a short explanation, trying to keep my tone calm and rational, trying not to sound like a man coming undone. His response came 2 days later. Just one line. "Arthur, this looks too real." And then nothing. I sent follow-up messages. I called his number. No answer. After a week, his wife replied, saying that Eduardo was not feeling well and could not talk. She did not explain further. She did not need to. I understood. He had seen something he could not explain, and it had frightened him. It had frightened him enough to cut contact with the person who had shown it to him. I was alone again, alone with the video and the knowledge it contained. I thought about going to the police, about showing them the footage and demanding an investigation, but I knew what would happen. They would look at me with pity or amusement. They would say it was a hoax, a costume, a trick of light and shadow. They would tell me to get more rest, to spend time with my family, to stop living alone in a house that was too big and too quiet. And perhaps they would be right to doubt. After all, we live in a world that has mapped every mountain and charted every ocean. We live in a world where mysteries are supposed to have been solved, where creatures of folklore are nothing more than stories told to frighten children. But standing in that kitchen, looking at the frozen image on my screen, I knew that the world was larger and stranger than we allow it to be. I knew that there are things that exist in the spaces between our certainty and our fear, things that watch us from the fog and the dark. That night, I printed a single frame from the video, the clearest shot of the figure standing among the trees. I pinned it to the wall above my desk next to an old photograph of Clara and me on our wedding day. She is smiling in the photo, young and bright and full of life. And beside her, in black and white, the figure stands, faceless and vast, a shadow made solid. I stare at both images now, and I wonder what Clara would say. Would she believe me? Would she hold my hand and tell me that it will be all right? Or would she look at me with that sad, patient expression she used to have near the end, when the illness had taken her clarity but not her kindness? I do not know. I only know that I have seen something. I have recorded it. And now I must live with the weight of that knowledge, the burden of proof that no one wants to carry. The camera sits on my desk, its lens dark and empty. I will not use it again. I do not need to, because now I know that it is there, out in the fog, moving through the trees with slow, deliberate steps. And I know, deep in the part of me that still remembers how to be afraid, that it knows I am here too. The nights grew longer after that, not in hours but in weight, in the way time stretches when you are afraid, when every sound becomes a question and every silence becomes an answer you do not want to hear. I stopped sleeping properly. I would lie in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. The wood would creak, the wind would press against the walls. And somewhere out there, beyond the fog, I knew it was moving. I began keeping a journal. It seemed like the rational thing to do, the engineer in me needing data, needing patterns. I wrote down the times I heard the sounds, the directions they seemed to come from, the conditions of the weather. I drew small maps on graph paper, marking where I found new tracks where the grass had been flattened, where branches had been broken at heights no human could reach. I thought that if I could find a pattern, I could predict it. I could understand it. But there was no pattern. The marks appeared in different places each time, as if whatever made them was wandering without purpose, or perhaps with a purpose I could not comprehend. Some nights it came close to the house. I would hear that dragging sound, slow and deliberate, circling the property like it was learning the shape of my life. Other nights it stayed near the tree line, and I would see the branches moving in the dark, swaying when there was no wind. And always, always, there was that smell. Damp earth and metal, like old coins left in the rain, like blood mixed with soil. It would seep into the house even when the windows were closed, even when I tried to seal every crack and gap. It would fill my lungs and coat my throat, and I would wake gasping, not sure if I was drowning or suffocating. I tried showing the video to the local police. I drove into town on a Wednesday afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds, and I sat in the small station with its fluorescent lights and worn linoleum floors. The officer on duty was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a patient smile. He watched the video on my laptop, his expression neutral, and when it finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He said it looked like someone in a costume. He said the area attracts tourists and hikers, people looking for adventure or trying to create viral videos. He said he understood that living alone could be unsettling, that the mind plays tricks when we spend too much time isolated. He was kind about it, gentle even, but I saw the look in his eyes. He thought I was a lonely old man, confused and frightened by shadows. He promised to send a patrol car by the property, but I knew he would not. And he did not. I left the station and sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time, watching people walk by with their groceries and their children, living their ordinary lives. I felt like a ghost among them, like I'd crossed some invisible line that separated their world from mine. They lived in a place where strange footprints were pranks and unexplained sounds were just the wind. I lived somewhere else now, somewhere darker and more honest. On the drive home, I heard a news report on the radio. A hiker had captured footage of what they called a giant figure in the fog, somewhere in the mountains about 20 kilometers from my property. The video had been shared online, analyzed by experts, debunked as a hoax. The reporter's voice was light, almost amused, as if the whole thing was a charming local mystery, something to talk about over coffee. I turned off the radio and drove the rest of the way in silence. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving for no particular occasion. I poured a glass and watched the amber liquid catch the lamplight. I thought about calling my children, telling them everything, asking them to come get me. But what would I say? That I had seen something in the fog? That I was afraid of sounds in the night? They would put me in a home, somewhere with nurses and medication and activities designed to keep the elderly occupied. They would do it out of love, out of concern, and I would lose the only thing I had left, this house, this land, these memories of Clara. I drank the whiskey and felt it burn down my throat, warm and sharp. And I made a decision. If no one would believe me, if no one would help me, then I would face this alone. I would document everything. I would gather every piece of evidence I could find. And when it was over, when I understood what this thing was and what it wanted, I would leave a record, so that someone, someday, might believe. I started going outside at night. Not far, just to the edge of the porch, where I could see the tree line and the orchard beyond. I would stand there with a flashlight in one hand and my father's old hunting rifle in the other, though I knew the rifle was more for comfort than protection. What could I shoot that I could not see? What could I kill that might not even be alive in the way I understood life? The fog would roll in around me, thick and cold, and I would listen. Sometimes I heard nothing. Sometimes I heard the dragging sound, distant and slow, like something being pulled across the earth with great effort. And sometimes, on the worst nights, I would hear breathing, deep and slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the dark. Not human breathing. Something larger, something that took in air like it was tasting it, like it was sampling the world through scent and temperature. I never saw it clearly during those nights. Just shapes in the fog, suggestions of movement, the sense of something massive passing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. But I felt it watching me. I felt its attention like a physical thing, heavy and patient and curious. And I wondered if it was studying me the way I was trying to study it, if we were both trying to understand something incomprehensible, two forms of life standing on opposite sides of an invisible boundary. The fear became routine. That is the strange thing about terror, about living with it day after day. It stops being a shock and becomes a condition, like arthritis or insomnia. You learn to function with it. You learn to eat breakfast while your hands shake, to read books while your heart races, to sleep in 20-minute intervals because longer than that feels dangerous. You learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep living despite it. I began to lose weight. My clothes hung loose on my frame, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger, someone hollow and gray. My children called and asked if I was eating enough, if I was taking care of myself. I lied and said yes. I lied because the truth was too complicated, too impossible. How could I explain that I was being haunted by something that left footprints and smelled like metal? How could I make them understand that their father, the engineer who built bridges and believed in evidence, had stumbled into a story that had no logical ending? The journal grew thicker. Pages and pages of observations, sketches, timestamps. I documented everything with the same precision I had once used to calculate load-bearing weights and structural integrity. But this data led nowhere. It formed no conclusions. It was just a record of terror, a catalog of sleepless nights and unexplained phenomena. And through it all, the fog kept rising from the river, thick and white and patient, as if the valley itself was breathing, as if the land was exhaling secrets it had kept buried for too long. I stood at my window and watched it come, night after night, and I knew that I was no longer in control of my own life. Something else had taken control, something vast and ancient and indifferent, and all I could do was wait and watch and try to understand before it was too late. The cycle had begun, and I was caught in it, turning like a wheel that would not stop until something broke. I just hoped that when it finally did break, when the pattern finally revealed itself, I would still be whole enough to see it. The collapse came on a Tuesday, though I only know this because I checked the calendar afterward, trying to piece together the timeline of my own unraveling. Time had become unreliable, days blurred into nights, and nights stretched into something that felt eternal. I'd stopped eating regularly. I'd stopped shaving. The house had taken on a stale smell, the smell of a life no longer being lived but merely endured. It was late or early, the hour when darkness is absolute, and even the fog seems to retreat into itself. I was sitting in my chair by the window, the rifle across my lap, when I heard something new. Not the dragging sound, not the breathing, but a scraping, metal against wood, coming from the back of the house. I stood slowly, my joints protesting, my heart already accelerating into that familiar sick rhythm. The sound continued, deliberate, methodical. I moved through the dark house, not turning on lights, not wanting to announce myself. When I reached the kitchen, I could see through the window that led to the back porch. There, in the faint light of the moon breaking through the clouds, I saw the marks. Deep gouges in the wooden wall, fresh splinters pale against the old weathered boards. They ran vertically, 4 parallel lines, as if something with claws or fingers had dragged them down the surface with immense force. I stood frozen, staring at those marks, and I understood that this was different. Before, the presence had stayed outside, had kept its distance, had observed from the fog and the tree line. But now it had touched my house, it had marked my walls. It had crossed some invisible threshold, and I did not know what that meant or what would come next. I backed away from the window and returned to the front room, my breath coming fast and shallow. The generator, which had been running all evening, suddenly sputtered and died. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. I stood there with the rifle in my hands, listening to the silence, and I felt the air change. It grew heavier, thicker, as if the pressure had dropped, as if a storm was coming, even though the night was still. Then I heard the gate. The metal gate at the front of the property, the one that squeaks when it opens, the one I have been meaning to oil for years. It moved slowly, the sound stretching out, and I knew that something was pushing it open. Not the wind, not an animal, something with intention, something with purpose. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body told me to grab my keys, get in the truck, and drive until the sun came up and the world made sense again. But I could not move. Fear had rooted me to the floor, had turned my legs to stone and my blood to ice. So I stood there in the dark, gripping the rifle, and I waited. The front door is solid wood, thick and heavy, with a deadbolt I check every night, but as I stood there, I watched the handle begin to turn, slowly, testing. The deadbolt held, but the door rattled in its frame, shaking as if something was pressing against it, feeling its strength, measuring its resistance. And then I heard the breathing again, right there on the other side, separated from me by 3 inches of wood, and a lock that suddenly felt terribly fragile. The air inside the house grew colder. My breath misted in front of my face. The lights, still dead, began to flicker faintly, the bulbs glowing with a dim orange light even though the generator was silent. Static electricity crackled through the room, making the hair on my arms stand up, making my skin prickle with a sensation that was not quite pain, but not quite anything else either. I do not know how long I stood there. Minutes, hours. Time had stopped meaning anything. All that existed was the door, the breathing, and the terrible understanding that something was waiting for me to move, to speak, to acknowledge its presence. And I knew in that moment that if I did, if I gave it any sign of recognition, something irreversible would happen. So I stayed silent. I stayed still. And eventually, after what felt like an eternity compressed into seconds, the breathing stopped. The pressure in the air lifted. The door stopped rattling. And slowly, with that same dragging sound I had come to know so well, the presence moved away from the porch, across the yard, and back toward the tree line. When the dawn finally came, gray and weak through the fog, I was still standing in the same spot. My legs were numb, my hands were cramped around the rifle, my throat was raw, though I did not remember, screaming. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The gate was open, hanging crooked on its hinges. The yard was torn up, the grass flattened in wide swaths that led from the tree line to the porch and back again. And there, in the mud and the dew, were the marks. Hundreds of them. Footprints, drag marks, impressions that looked like something had lain down in the earth and pressed its full weight into the ground. The marks covered everything, chaotic and overlapping, as if the thing had been pacing, circling, trying to decide what to do. And then I saw the camera. the security camera I had mounted weeks ago, the one that had captured the first footage. It had been ripped from its mount and thrown into the dirt. When I picked it up, my hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The casing was cracked, the lens shattered, and covering the metal body was a dark substance, sticky and thick. I did not need to examine it closely to know what it was. Blood. But not mine. Not any animals I recognized. It was too dark, too viscous, with an odor that made my stomach turn. I carried the camera inside and placed it on the kitchen table, next to the journal and the printed photographs and all the other evidence I had been collecting. I stared at it for a long time, at the blood drying brown on the metal, and I realized that I had lost something during the night. Not just the camera, not just my sense of safety. I had lost the belief that I could understand this, that I could document it and explain it and make it fit into the rational world I had always lived in. This was beyond understanding. This was beyond evidence and data and scientific method. This was something primal and ancient, something that existed in a space where logic did not reach and reason did not apply. And I was alone with it, trapped in a house on a hillside, surrounded by fog, with no one to call and nowhere to run. I thought about Clara. I thought about the way she used to hold my hand when I was worried, the way she would tell me that not everything needed to be understood, that some things simply needed to be accepted. I wished she was there. I wished I could hear her voice telling me it would be all right, even if it was a lie. But she was gone, and I was here. And the thing in the fog was still out there, waiting, watching, drawing closer with each passing night. I could feel it now, even in daylight, even with the sun trying to burn through the clouds. I could feel its attention like a weight on my shoulders, like a hand pressed against the back of my neck. The house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a cage. And I was the animal inside, waiting for the moment when the door would finally open and something would reach in to claim me. I write these words now, knowing they may be the last I ever write. The light is fading from the valley, and the fog is beginning its slow climb from the river, the way it does. Every evening, the way it has done for as long as I have lived here. But tonight feels different. Tonight the air's heavier, the silence deeper, and I can feel something gathering in the spaces between the trees, something patient and vast and inevitable. My children came last week. I did not call them. They simply arrived, pulling into the driveway in a rental car, their faces tight with concern. They walked through the house and saw the journals scattered across every surface, the photographs pinned to the walls, the broken camera sitting like an artifact on the kitchen table. They saw the dark circles under my eyes and the weight I had lost in the way my hands shook when I tried to pour coffee. And they decided together, without asking me, that I could not stay here anymore. They spoke softly, the way you speak to someone who is fragile, someone who might break if you use the wrong words. They said I needed help. They said I needed rest. They said living alone was not good for me, that grief and isolation had played tricks on my mind. They showed me pamphlets for assisted living facilities, places with gardens and community activities and 24-hour care. Places where I would be safe, places where I would forget. I tried to explain. I showed them the evidence, the measurements, the videos, the photographs. I showed them the scratches on the wall and the marks in the yard. But they looked at me with such sadness, such gentle pity, that I understood nothing I said would change their minds. To them, I was a confused old man, haunted by loneliness and loss, seeing patterns in randomness and monsters in shadows. They could not see what I had seen. They could not feel what I had felt. And I realized, standing there in the kitchen while they discussed my future, as if I was not present, that this was the price of truth, isolation, disbelief, the knowledge that you have witnessed something real and undeniable, and yet you are utterly alone in that knowledge. They left yesterday, promising to return next week with a moving truck. They hugged me before they went, and I could feel their worry and their frustration, the way they were already grieving for the father they thought they had lost. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away, and I knew I would not be here when they came back. The town responded differently. After the second video surfaced, the one from the hiker, the local government decided to act, not to investigate, but to erase. They sent workers to cut down the trees along the ridge, the ones that bordered my property and stretched into the forest beyond. They said it was for safety, for preventing fires, for improving access to trails. But I knew better. I knew they wanted to eliminate the darkness, to let light into the spaces where things could hide. They wanted to pretend that if they removed the shadows, they removed what lived in them. I watched from my window as the chainsaws roared and the old trees fell, one after another, crashing to the ground in clouds of dust and splintered wood. And I thought about how much easier it is to destroy than to understand, how much simpler it is to deny something than to face it. The world prefers its mysteries buried, its questions unanswered, its strange corners smoothed and paved and made ordinary. But I remember every sound, every mark, every moment of fear. I remember the weight of being watched, the smell of wet metal, the sight of those eyes staring at me through the camera lens. And I know that cutting down trees will not change anything. Whatever is out there does not need darkness to exist. It only needs the fog. And the fog still comes. I have been thinking about truth lately, about what it costs and what it means. I spent my whole life pursuing it, measuring it, proving it. I believed that truth was noble, that it brought clarity and understanding. But I was wrong. Truth is not noble. Truth is not kind. Truth is simply what is, regardless of whether we want to see it or not. And once you have seen it, once you have recognized it and named it and held it in your hands, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to the comfortable lie of ignorance. I have seen something that exists outside the boundaries of the world I thought I knew. I have documented it, recorded it, gathered evidence that should convince anyone with eyes to see. But evidence means nothing when people have already decided what they believe. They will explain away the footprints. They will dismiss the videos as hoaxes. They will diagnose me with dementia or delusion or despair. They will do anything except accept that the world is stranger and more terrible than they want it to be. And so I am left alone with my knowledge, standing in this old house as the fog rises and the night comes on. I think about Clara, about how she used to say that some things were beyond understanding, that some mysteries were meant to stay mysteries. I used to argue with her about that. I used to insist that everything could be explained, that the universe operated on principles we could discover and prove. But now I understand what she meant. Some things exist in the spaces between logic and faith, between the seen and the unseen, and we are not meant to bridge that gap. We are meant to accept it, to live with it, to acknowledge that we are smaller than we think, and the world is larger than we can imagine. The fog is thick now. I can see it pressing against the windows, white and formless, erasing the orchard and the road and everything beyond. In a few hours it will be dark, and I will hear the sounds again, the dragging and the breathing and the weight of something moving through the night. Part of me is terrified, part of me is exhausted, and part of me, the part that has been an engineer and a husband and a father and a man who believed in facts, that part is almost curious. I want to see it clearly, just once. I want to stand face to face with whatever has been watching me and understand, finally, what it is and what it wants. Maybe that is foolish. Maybe that is the last illusion of a mind that has spent too long alone. But I have nothing left to lose. My family thinks I'm crazy. The world thinks I'm a liar. And this house, this land, these memories of Clara, they will all be taken from me soon anyway. So what does it matter if I step out into the fog one more time? What does it matter if I walk to the tree line and wait? I have left these pages on the table, weighted down with Clara's favorite stone, the smooth gray one she found on the beach during our honeymoon. If someone finds them, if my children or the police or some stranger comes looking, at least there will be a record. At least someone will know that I was here, that I saw something, that I tried to understand. The truth has cost me everything. My peace, my family's trust, my sense of safety in the world. But I would not trade it, not even now, because living in comfortable ignorance is not living at all. It is only sleeping. And I have been awake, truly awake, for the first time in my life. The fog is at the door now. I can hear something moving in it, slow and patient and close. My hands are steady as I write these final words. I'm not afraid anymore. Or perhaps I'm so afraid that I've passed through fear and emerged on the other side into something quieter and more accepting. This is where the story ends. Not with answers, but with questions. Not with victory, but with acceptance. I do not know what waits for me in the fog, but I know that I will face it alone, as I have faced everything else since Clara died, and maybe that is enough. Maybe that is all any of us can do in the end, face the unknown with whatever courage we can gather and trust that there is meaning in the facing, even if we never understand what we have faced. The price of truth is solitude, and the price of solitude is being the only one who can still see clearly. Goodbye.